Hello there, very good morning to you. It's day one since the establishment of the highest legislature, and we are at a very exciting time and age of Stephanie Lazarus, and we meet you on yet another edition of Newsline. Is that right for us?
Absolutely, and good morning to you, and how are you?
I'm all right, I'm doing good.
What are the headlines have?
Yeah, there are a couple of things the papers have highlighted, and the important thing was the establishment of the 8th Parliament. Daily Mirror goes on to say that Karu is Speaker, Tilanga Deputy Speaker, and TNA Adekalanathan Deputy Chairman of Committees. And it has also headlined that President outlines National Unity Government, and also on Ceylon today, battle rages for opposition leaders post. And it also says that President urges for national consensus. Well, we should be outlining a few things about the national government, and also President extensively speaks about how about the 20th Amendment and how reforms should be made for the executive presidency. He also says that intellectuals who appoints Speaker and Deputy Speaker, and he also says that they should be brought back to the country, intellectuals who left the country. And few things about the opposition as well. There's a lot of confusion surrounding as to who the opposition leader is going to be in Parliament, and there's also a lot of rifts between parties and who the national government is going to be and what parties are going to consist.
That's right.
To consist in the government, in the national government in the future, and there are a lot of reforms that will take place in the future. Is that right, Faraz?
Well, yes, it augurs well. Now that we've put all the war and so on behind us, we can look forward to the strategies that Ranil Wickremesinghe and his government, or rather President Sirisena's government, have in store for the country, their vision.
And also Daily Mirror says that President says that new electoral system will be priority during his tenure. What do you think he meant by? Does it mean that a mixed electoral system will be introduced?
One of the cornerstones of his manifesto, President Sirisena's, was to achieve the 20th Amendment, which had these electoral reforms, and for various reasons, which perhaps our guest this morning will expand on, the 20th Amendment wasn't achieved in the life of the so-called 100-day Parliament. It wasn't for 100 days, it went on for a little bit more than that. And so President Sirisena has always said and maintained that he wishes to see his mandate he received, that he wants to achieve those promises that he undertook, because he says and has said and continues to say that is on that basis that he was elected, and in that very famous victory over President Rajapaksa.
So does that mean that it will be unfair on minor parties if the mixed electoral system?
They say that the role or the benefits or the protection that's afforded to the minor parties will not be compromised, and that's the whole essence of discussing this. So hopefully.
We have Professor Rajiva Vijayasinghe with us, who is the leader of the Liberal Party, and you are going to speak extensively about what the President meant by saying that he will make amendments to the Executive President. The Parliament has to decide on it. Could you please elaborate on that, Professor Rajiva?
Yes, could you actually say that, if you start with this, they signed an MOU between the SLFP and the UNP, indicating that they are going in for a coalition, and then slowly but steadily, they have introduced the word national government. And we then have the President yesterday in Parliament saying national consensus government. Now, is this being done to bypass the upper limits of the provisions contained in the 19th Amendment, the limit of 30 and 40?
I think you have a very good point there, but let's go back to the beginnings. Many of us supported President Sirisena because we needed a change way back last November. I think a couple of us came out immediately because we just felt that the previous government had reached the end of its tether.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, the manifesto that many of us helped to draft was completely ignored after January 16th. Except for the 19th Amendment, 5 salient points were ignored: electoral reform, strengthening Parliament through amendments to standing orders, the Code of Conduct, the Audit Bill, and, of course, the right to information. And I personally felt that what we had was a UNP government, and that UNP government was not doing what President Sirisena had promised. He himself told us that he was very keen on electoral amendment. Now, 2 years ago, when 3 parties came out with ideas for changing the constitution, I told the One Text Initiative, and then I wrote to Ranil Wickramasinghe and to Reverend Sobitha, but I'm afraid in my ignorance I wrote to the wrong Reverend Sobitha, to say there are 2 vital changes we need: electoral reform and reducing the size of the cabinet. The electoral reform effort was tiny because I'm afraid the UNP completely ignored it. And I'm very glad that President Sirisena has brought it onto center stage. My friends who have been elected have told me about the horrendous amounts they had to spend. And all that went up in smoke.
You know, it went up on what?
On getting elected. On this mad Manapa system when you're competing in a whole district. You have to have transport for the district, you have to have people to put up posters, you have to do canvassing. It is monstrously unfair. So that must be changed. I think President Sirisena's commitment is very important.
So the 19th Amendment, 46.4, I think, talks of the limit of 30 cabinet ministers and 40 non-cabinet.
Yes. In fact, on that particular issue, I think it was a grave mistake to add an additional clause to say the event of a national government, Parliament can decide how many ministers there should be.
That's right. Why was that? If they wanted to stop this trading in the so-called conscience vote, then why give them an opt-out clause? Why not?
Because I'm afraid very few people actually function completely on principle. You know, one of the reasons I'm mocked is they say you're not practical. I moved an amendment to abolish that clause. But of course, no one wanted it. They had introduced it only for this parliament. That was changed for any parliament. But there's a strange definition of national government, and that's why I think President Sirisena is right to talk of national consensus government. The English says a government where the main party, together with the parties in parliament.
In the plural.
Yeah. And that implies that a national government is a truly national government. And if, say, the TNA and the JVP don't accept portfolios, it's not a national government.
We had the mayor of Colombo, Mr. A.J. Muzammil, on our show 2 days ago, in which he attempted to say that this provision was actually not in the final version, which is, of course, not true. He was mistaken. I'm glad you're making that point. Carry on, Professor.
Can I also say that what happened is because there was chaos in the 19th Amendment, it was not introduced through consensus and discussion. One very important point is that normally in other countries, legislation is discussed in committee first. And that's where consensus is reached, because in the House, people are shouting at each other. Not that our parliament is worse than many parliaments in the world, people shout. This was not brought to a committee. And one of our changes in standing orders is to make it very clear that legislation must be discussed with cool heads in committee. So actually, I don't blame Mr. Muzammil because there was such chaos when this was passed.
Yes.
Now, the result is this definition that I think would make it difficult to say what we're having is a national government. But the Sinhala says paksha, so you can say, well, there are 2 or 3.
Right.
It's not all. But I think it would have been better if President Sirisena had used his moral authority to tell the SLFP, look, let's have a coalition government, let's stick to 30 and 40. Let's not multiply ministries. And one of the factors I did in January is I told Mr. Jayasuriya, who I'm so glad is Speaker because he's a man of great integrity, I said, Mr. Jayasuriya, why don't we change this system? Everyone wants a ministry because of the perks. Most of them don't want to do any work in the ministry. We found that. So let's give more perks to parliamentarians and cut down the ministry perks.
So
the country will cost less,
and
then cut down the number of ministries. I do hope that tomorrow when this is discussed, people realize this is not a national government, and President Sirisena, I think, has the authority to tell the SLFP, look, let the UNP have, let's say, 20 portfolios and we have 10. Let there be deputy ministers, more to them, let's say even 30 and 10. Let's have a coalition government. Let us move solidly on the reforms that I promised in my manifesto. And let's ensure that those pass within the next year.
Professor, nothing wrong with you hoping to live in a utopian democracy. No harm in hoping for that. But now then, what about this business about the leader of the opposition? Here we have agreement between the SLFP and the UNP. There is no such thing as the UNFGG that resides in the imagination of the Prime Minister and his colleagues. The official recognized party is the UNP. They signed an MOU with the SLFP. Now, how can that party then also form the opposition?
Well, there are two factors to remember here. When the Daily News asked me, they cited what I said, but they omitted to say that I quoted my father, who in 1977 had told Prime Minister Jayawardena, the leadership of the opposition should go to the possible alternative government, because of an equally mad electoral system. The TNA had the second highest number of seats, but the SLFP had, 5 times the number of votes. Jayawardena didn't take that advice. He was determined to crush the SLFP. Fortunately, the President is not in that position. I think there's a very easy constitutional solution to this, which is that the MOU is between the government. The government is not the UNP alone, because don't forget people like Champika and all have signed for that, and the SLMC and Rishad, but it's between the government and the SLFP. But the main opposition party is the UPFA. Now, I think President Sirisena made a mistake. I think he was so worried about the possibility of majority UPFA that he engaged in various stratagems on the Friday before. And because of the way the nationalist has been constituted, the strength of the non-SLFP UPFA lies with people who are not sympathetic to him. I think it was a great pity that what I would call the great moderate forces, especially someone like Gunasekara, is not in Parliament. Because you could have had the UPFA being A, the leaders of the opposition, but agreeing on someone acceptable to President Sirisena, and B, the SLFP, and the UPFA could have agreed that the SLFP component of the UPFA could be part of the coalition if they wished, and at the same time the opposition would have been the UPFA, because the purpose is to give constructive support to the Sirisena agenda, which goes back to January. And not necessarily, I don't think there's great incompatibility, but the UNP agenda, wherever it's compatible with the President's agenda. Constitutionally, you have to remember the President's agenda comes first because the head of government is the President. Now, Ranil Wickremesinghe has an obligation to fulfill his own manifesto, obviously, because he won a general election on the strength of it, but it is up to Parliament to ensure that the primacy goes to the presidential manifesto, and where the two can work together, and there are plenty of areas where they can.
I think we need to make the point that Ranil Wickremesinghe won the largest number of seats. He didn't really win the election per se.
That is a very good point, and that is why not only does constitutional President Sirisena's manifesto take precedence, but it is the government of President Sirisena, the coalition government, and that government must concentrate first on the President's manifesto, including, let me say, the many items in the longer manifesto that were completely ignored. But of course, they should not go for anything that's incompatible with the UNP manifesto, because the UNP is, after all, the largest idea. But as I keep telling everybody, there are always 90% areas of consensus. Don't argue about the 10% on which you disagree.
And here, Kumar Velgama, the former transport minister, has been slated to become the next opposition leader. And MP Vasudeva Nanayakkara had given out that statement saying that 55 of them had already signed, saying that he should become opposition leader. So how is it going to work? As in, if the UPFA member going to be opposition leader?
Well, I have no idea. I'm not in Parliament, as you know. And of course, the discussion.
We should have said that in the introduction. Leader of the Liberal Party and not
a member of Parliament. Because so far you've described me as both. So I don't really quite know the internal workings of the opposition at the moment. I do know that when I was in Parliament, I signed for Nimal Siripala de Silva.
We should be heading into a short commercial break, and we will see you on the other side. We'll come back to Newsland, where we were talking about former Minister Kumar Velgama being slated to become opposition leader, and there's a lot of confusion between parties as to who will become opposition leader. Is it going to be R. Sambandan, the leader of the Tamil National Alliance, who had by far been the only party to have allocated many seats after the UPFA. So what is this dilemma about?
Well, as I said, if my father, who I think was perhaps the best Secretary General that Parliament had and understood parliamentary practice was correct, it should be the alternative government. That is why I think it should be the UPFA that occupies this position. I should also add that the TULF needs to be very careful, because while I believe both Mr. Sambandan and Mr. Sumantiran, and indeed Mr. Siddharthan, are all very moderate people, the minute they become leaders of the opposition, there will be a lot of pressure to them from the more extremist elements and the diaspora, just as happened to Mr. Amithalingam way back in 77. So I think for their sakes as well, it would be good if they were not made leaders of the opposition. They could then make a lot of fuss and raise issues, and could be compensated by a more productive way of actually negotiating with them on a political solution.
Don't you think there will be a perfect balance between the voices and opinions that are being raised in Parliament, at least if TNA becomes opposition?
Not at all, because don't forget there's a 43% which did not vote for the UNP. And while I think President Sirisena is right to try to move his agenda forward, you cannot not give those people a voice. Look what happened in the 80s when, you know, opposition voices were still, it all went underground. The same thing actually happened with the LTTE. But to me the solution, as I said, is a UPFA leadership. I wish there had been more, let's say, discussion between the President and the UPFA. In a sad way, I think the moral authority in the UPFA, which should have been with its Secretary Sushil Premchand, passed because of the nationalist
problem. Just as Paras said earlier, how can a governing party become the opposition at the same time?
It is not a governing party. The point I made was the MOU is not with the UPFA, it's with the SLF.
So the party
if you go back to what happened, you know, Ranil Wickremesinghe cited this in January, what happened in Britain when the Liberal Party split. The Prime Minister was Lloyd George, who was a member of the Liberal Party, but the opposition, led by Asquith, the former Prime Minister, was actually provided the leadership of the opposition. And there were hopes that in time the two parts would come together again. In fact, Lloyd George's section vanished, you know, within 10 years, and he remained a lone voice. So I think you have precedent for a component of a coalition supporting a government. And that's why I think it's not a national government, it's a consensus, national consensus government, and the alternative perspectives. But I think President Sirisena's worry would be if those alternative perspectives are hostile. And that's why, as I said, I think it would have been better if the UPFA had a broader spectrum of opinion in it, which would have absolutely been committed to the January agenda. And also
Professor Rajiva, while leader of the Democratic Front, Vasudeva Nanayakkara, had said that Velgama is slated to become opposition leader. The UPFA secretary, Professor Vishwa Vanupala, says that they've still not decided who the opposition leader is going to be. So there's also a division between...
part of the problem is that people take pronouncements seriously that have no authority. Vasu is pushing his case. But, you know, I think one of the problems, in fact, I told him the other day, when they moved the vote of no confidence in Ranil.
But they were able to drum up support, about 55 MPs.
But it's not a question of numbers, because the Speaker must take the decision. And I hope that there will be a consensus decision based on discussions with the President and the Speaker. Welcome is not a contentious person. You know, had they announced some people who were good. But let it be by consensus is what I think should be done within the UPFA. I hope that neither Viswa
hold that thought.
nor
We will be
Vasu
heading into a short commercial break right now, and we will see you on the other side.